How you guys doing?
Hey, what's up, man?
Not too much.
Here he is.
How have you guys been?
Doing good, doing good.
How about you?
Doing well. Just trying to act like I've been here before, like I know how to use Zoom.
No, that's fair. We were just having an issue with the audio on our end too. I'm like, why is this not working?
Okay. Cool.
But it looks like it's good now. Can you hear us all right?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, perfect.
Nice.
Awesome. So I wrote up a brief outline. Thank you so much, by the way, for reaching out. We had a blast with Max the other day, and I'm excited to get on with you again today. The Rhode Strength Podcast is now brought to you by Rob Levine, the heavy hitter. We're really happy to have them jump on as a sponsor. I personally used them this past year. My wife was in a car accident, and they were able to help us along every step of the way through getting properly compensated, making sure we weren't getting taken advantage of by the car insurance companies, and helping through with medical payments. So if you've been in a car accident, it's definitely worthwhile. Just pick up the phone and see how they can help. And then I got the dogs with me here, and they were pretty good with Max, but I hope they're fine. If they start barking, I'm gonna throw them outside. But so far so good. They're doing pretty good.
And then I'm recovering from the flu, so I still have this like dry cough. So if it's too much, just let me know, and I'll do my best to step away.
So we're a mess.
Yeah, no, I get it. You must podcast through though. You got to persevere.
Yeah,
exactly.
Do it for the listeners. Yeah.
He hasn't got me sick yet, so we're not on wood.
Yeah.
All right.
I love that you're in such close proximity to him though, and you're like, no, I'm not sick yet.
Right.
No fear.
I should get the COVID barrier. But all right, so we'll get started. What's going on, guys? Dr. Matt here, host of the Rhode Strength Podcast. We got co-host Jared Smith on me today.
Hello.
A fellow weightlifting coach in the area over at Rhode Island Performance. And we got Joshua Gibson on the podcast. What's going on, Josh?
Living the dream. It's
it.
always awesome to be on the other side of a podcast. I record I talk to so many people and deep dive on so many different topics. It's fun to be able to be another part of that in a different way.
Totally. Yeah. And like doing some of the research for this podcast, I was super excited to look through. You have a ton of podcasts out there. I mean, you run the philosophical weightlifting podcast, and I know you're also part of the Coach Logic mentorship group with Max Zeta, and have been a frequent collaborator, co-host on Weightlifting House, which I think is one of the biggest weightlifting podcasts out there. So it's been really cool to do the research, and it'll be cool to get you on the podcast.
Yeah, no, and it's fun, being a part of so many different projects and being involved with so many different forms of content creation from the standpoint of being able to constantly explore cool topics and things that are kind of different from what most people generally encounter and generally think about. And then also like understanding what kind of traction it gets. So with podcasts, you have metrics like listenership, and you have like number of hits, and you have reshares, so you can kind of get a sense of like, what do people like, what do people want to listen to, what draws people in. And sometimes you hate to do it, but the clickbaity titles, they really help sell it.
It's so tough. That's something I've thought about before. I'm definitely not on the scope where it's as important as far as like need to get as many downloads as possible, but I see it with YouTube a lot, with as far as like some of the big creators that I really like guys like Jeff Nippert or what's his name, Lane Norton, and I can tell they put out incredible content, but I can tell they're like, I can see where they're using like the clips, and like because you have to, if you want to get traction, you have to, which is tough, but at the same time, you got to play the game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a lot of that too is you have to compete with people who are doing the same thing. But
right.
And can I curse on the show?
Go for it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but put out bullshit. Right?
Yes.
So it's like you have people who are putting out bullshit, and it's clickbaity and attractive, and you want to watch it. Then you have people who are doing good work, like Lane Norton, like Eric Helms, like Jeff Nippert. Mm-hmm. And Jeff Nippert, honestly, I came up on some of his content. He had I think it was Ice Cream Fitness podcast, or Ice Cream for PRs, or something like that. So those guys in the evidence-based realm with training and nutrition, those were the guys who put out information that I cut my teeth on when I was getting into it.
Kind of on that note, Josh, you've got your hands in a lot. Like you've got a few podcasts you're on, and on your podcast specifically, like you have guests that range like so many different topics.
Yeah.
Where have you found that lately the most traction is coming from? Like, what are people most interested in?
Yeah, I would say that one consistent hit is hypertrophy and building muscle. I notice when
What do
it's
you
like
think brings that about?
everyone wants to look good, right?
Sure, but I feel like to your point, like it has become a major topic as of late.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's like, okay, what would make it even more popular than just knowing like people want to look beach ready, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, and I think what I really enjoy and what I hope a lot of the listeners and viewers enjoy is taking a topic, something that can be really straightforward, something simple like go into the gym and do, more work than you did last time, and you're more likely to build muscle. And they can say, okay, but I'm not satisfied with just that. How do I get even bigger? Right? How
Sure.
do how do I get even stronger? Right?
Yeah.
How do I quote unquote like get closer to the potential that exists? I mean, we all have our abilities that are determined by a host of different factors. I actually just wrote an article about skill acquisition and performance, and it looks at like practice is this construct that people talk about, like you got to practice, but they don't mention that, your parents, the culture you grow up in, the relative age at which you start a sport, the coaching you get, those are all going to influence your ultimate performance potential.
Yeah.
So I think people are like, I want to be bigger, I want to be stronger. And as the pool of talent, especially in weightlifting, continues to climb, people want to qualify for finals and nationals. So instead of just how do I get big, it's like, how do I maximize the training I'm doing? And I think Max and I with Coach Logic want to be a part of that revolution in weightlifting where it's don't just settle for a 3x10, add some nuance, add some flair so that it's more effective. And what that does is it makes it more engaging. It kind of lifts the culture as a whole because everybody's getting better, right?
Sure.
When people start popping off for PRs, you're like, it's my turn. So that culture kind of brings an enrichment to the space alone from the individual. So I think there's like this multi-layered aspect of higher quality information, higher quality performances, higher quality teams, higher quality sport. It kind of checks all the boxes.
I go ahead.
I was going to say, what along those lines, can you think of an example? Because one of the articles you wrote recently was actually 2019, not too recently, but review of programming evidence-led versus tradition-driven, which is basically kind of exactly what you were just saying there. Anything that's come up recently, like let's say like past few months or a year or so that you're like, hey, like this is something that either I'm kind of rethinking or like, hey, this is something that's really important as far as like the scope of like training that's like, this is more evidence driven, like and any like insights that you've had recently as far as that goes?
Yeah, and I think, we didn't really intro the podcast necessarily or intro me as a guest. So hopefully people can find credence and believe what I'm saying. Because I am getting a PhD basically in applied sports science. Have a master's degree in applied sports science, coach education. I've coached, power lifters, top 5 in the nation, weightlifters, top 10 in the nation. I've been coaching for over a decade. I worked with Max and Joanne for a few years now at Team Ada. So have the coaching chops, have the working on the academic chops. And when I wrote that article, I had this belief that, classical periodization is kind of faulty, right? Like people talk about it in training kind of offhand and kind of casually, I'll work with some and they're like, yeah, I was doing a, periodized program. And it's like, I don't think people really understand that word as, 2 components. There's a planning and a programming component. The plan is time between competitions. What are you doing? Like, how are you allocating that time to develop as an athlete? And then you have the programming component, which is the pieces and parts. It's the X's and O's. It's putting pencil to paper and writing out, on this day, we're going to do no hook, no feet, 4 sets of 3 at 70 to 75%. That's driving a certain adaptation that's going to make you a better weightlifter. So when I wrote that, I was kind of under this illusion that, periodization was kind of faulty. And it's like, periodization is just a planning and programming concept. It's not, it doesn't dictate you do only 10s or only 5s, or you do something that's like daily undulating, or you do something that's weekly undulating or conjugate. It doesn't say any of that. There's no prescriptive element. It really just talks about like, hey, you're going to have 25 weeks. You're going to have a year, you're going to have 4 years. How do you allocate that to training an athlete and improving? The way you break it down is based on what you believe to be the best approach. And that can look a lot of different ways, but periodization itself, that's just a broad sports science kind of staple. So I've definitely changed my opinion on that, or I kind of sipped the Kool-Aid a little bit and thought I was like faulty. I would say that I think my opinion about coaching has changed. And I think like, at baseline, the standard by which I would want to hold other coaches to and want to hold the sport to has grown and elevated a lot. And that's kind of why Max and I started Coach Logic and are really driving that, is to try and just help develop the sport. So as I've grown, as I've kind of been in the public space with, developing content, pushing out content, knowing what available research says, how we can use it. It's like, okay, now how do we get everyone else to do that? How do we bring them in, so to speak, and give them access to people like you guys have access to, where you get Max 8 on for a chat. And it's like, Max, why do you love no hook, no feet snatches? Like, he loves it so much, he'd probably get it tattooed on his belly. So you can ask him that question and you can say, well, why do you use it and how do you use it? And he'll tell you exactly. So that's what I want, for all coaches, to open that space up. So that's kind of where my mindset's gone to. Yeah.
That's cool. Thank you.
What I love about both you and Max is both of your abilities to explain why you love no hook, no feet so much, because I think we did touch a little bit.
He did talk about that
with Max. And, and I tried to explain this to Matt. It's like everything that I wish I could say, he just is able to say it fluidly and smoothly. So I've always appreciated that about you guys.
No, and Max, I mean, he can even do the same thing for me. And I like to think that we occupy two different spaces slightly, where I really know theory really well. I know a lot of related concepts to training theory, how to plan it, how to program it, how to structure it, how to even think about, like, I wrote an article on like the coach athlete relationship. Like, I deep dove on a model put forth by a researcher in that space. And then you have Max, who has coached for 20 years, developed 5 senior American record holders in weightlifting, medalists, world medalists in powerlifting. It's like, he's reached that point where he understands theory very deeply, very strongly, but he crushes the application, which is what we all want. It's like, people get on about, what's it worth to know all this information in a textbook or in a research article, or, what's it worth if you can't apply it? And it's like, that's entirely true. But the first step to applying it is knowing it. So at some point we have to reach that junction. And that's where I've kind of been. And honestly, like, I moved out to live with Max like 2 years ago, and we met in Las Vegas, kind of for the first time. Basically, we did a few podcasts. Seb and I went out to California for the Weightlifting House Tour in 2019. And we did a podcast with Max, and I was like, Max, show me a program. Like, I have to know what you're doing and how you're doing it. Cause that's really how I learned to track data or track information with weightlifting, was through Max and Spencer Arnold. And I kind of kept in contact with Max a little bit, recorded a handful of podcasts that people can listen to. And then we were both in Vegas coaching at USA Powerlifting Nationals. We were at a coffee shop grabbing coffee, which we both love immensely. And he was sitting across from me. He's like, hey, yeah, we're kind of looking for someone to come out and run the gym. We have this, lifter in mind. And I was like, you put a pin in that. Like, I'll give you a call when I get back to Columbus, and then we'll see what happens. So I got back to Columbus, Ohio, where I was coaching at, for the last 2 years, 7 days a week, coaching as many people as possible. I called Max. I was like, hey, I want to move out and work with you. 2 weeks later, packed up my car and then drove 4 days to Vegas, where we coached at Weightlifting Nationals, drove another 10 hours with Seb and Joanne to Oakland, and then lived on his couch for 2 months. And then that was like the blossoming of this relationship.
That's great.
That's incredible. And that's cool. You were with, we didn't really touch upon it quite yet, but you spent a lot of time with Seb too, who's another huge figure in the in the weightlifting world.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm blown away by what he continues to do, because, I went to a weightlifting camp with him, I think in 2018. We were in Kansas with Glenn. I have a bunch of the stories up on my Instagram if people want to check them out. But it's like we met we went to pick him up from the airport in some city in Kansas, drove back, and then for like 10 days just lived together and did double days, maxed out all the time. And Seb and I think our relationship first started when I picked him up and I was asking him about his rowing days. It was like, yeah, you're a rower, you know, what's your best time? And he's like, oh, I think I rode like a 6:30 2K or whatever it is. And I was like, oh, I could beat that. And he's like, no, you can't. I was like, yeah, I could beat that. He's like, have you ever rode before? I was like, no, but I could still beat it. And that was kind of like the start of this, you know, we showed up to the gym, we lift on the same platform, we try to beat each other by 1 kilo. So it's the start of like a really strong friendship, and we've done I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of podcasts since. He actually went out to his wedding last year in Exeter and got to spend some time there with them. So yeah, it's been really awesome seeing him develop from a podcast. You know, I don't know if you guys know his story. You'll have to get him on at some point, but like convincing Glenn to come out to the UK, not having a driver's license to drive him around, having to get a car, booking seminars, and like makeshifting everything, and eventually just saying to Glenn, like, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And Glenn was like, yeah, let's do it. So Seb started that, and then first item he sells was a t-shirt. Second item was a barbell. It's like that's kind of the trajectory of Weightlifting House, right? That says a lot of
those early days were, I don't know, it's at this point now it's like so nostalgic to think about those first podcasts that you guys used to do with Glenn.
Yeah, I mean, and someone brought that up, and it was like the first podcast I remember listening to. So I helped clean houses back in like 2019, 2018, 2017. So I was doing my undergrad. So basically, like, long story short, I enrolled in college, dropped out, got my associates, enrolled in an undergrad program, and then I was like working cleaning houses part-time. And I remember I put on the first Weightlifting House podcast that I could find, and I was like, holy shit, Glenn's back on a podcast. I remember the muscle driver days. I remember weightlifting talk. I would consume those nonstop.
That's right.
Hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And the episode I picked was Glenn talking about chickens and his favorite weightlifters. And it's like, yeah, that pretty much summarized it, right? And then I started just like consuming all those. Honestly, we would record podcasts. So I would record with Seb, record with Glenn, like in random houses, in cars. I remember I was sitting outside of a gym in the dead of summer, it was like 90 plus degrees, in a car recording. I'm like, you can't pass this opportunity up when it comes. So
yeah,
that was kind of like my attempt at like, okay, how do I contribute? How do I be a part of it? And it's like, be the expert.
Yeah. Kind of getting back to what you just mentioned, how do you give back and how do you contribute? Can you talk a little bit about the coaching mentorship that you and Max I think you're just laying it out, right? Is that brand new or what?
Yeah. As with most like businesses or startups or ideas, you know, you have a great idea. You're like, I'm going to bite on it. And then you realize like, oh, we don't have anything. I mean, we have an idea, like we know our mission.
We have an idea.
Like, yeah, right. Which is like, our mission statement is to educate coaches. Ultimately, it's like to elevate the level of coach education in the US, and I would say across the world, because we have people from different countries. Yeah. And there was a podcast we recorded a while back, and I just started like ranting about, you know, coach education currently is, you know, here's why you move your feet in the snatch or the clean. And it's like, that's great. Like, people should know, like, oh yeah, pick your feet up, move them out. Mm-hmm. But that can't be the recurring message of like, what's coach education? It's finding a grip width. It's finding an overhead position. Those are basically like the things you need to be able to do to even play, right? It's the ante. Mm-hmm. So it's like, let's get a baseline understanding of like what the basics are, and then really try to develop athletes from there. And I think that's where Max and I are currently. It's, you know, we want to provide information of like what a hook grip is and how to use it, but it's only so you can use it to better understand programming and training and technique, right? So it's a means to a bigger end. And the Coach Logic mentorship group started largely out of that. And then it's developed its own format basically over time, to where we have a meeting the first Friday of every month, which is between Max and I. Or this week it's going to be with Chris Tabor, who's a PhD from ETSU in sport physiology, and we're going to talk training. That's going to set up the next call with an expert we bring in, who this month will be Kyle Travis, who did his a lot of his research and his dissertation on tapering and peaking, basically for strength in weightlifting. We're going to talk about maximal strength. We're going to talk about overreaching, talk about tapering and peaking, kind of deep dive in that. And then we have a case study, which the last one was Max. Max has been writing a program. We looked at the week of training, and we really broke it down. Like, what are you writing? Why are you writing it? How could someone use the information you're giving to better program for their athletes? Mm-hmm. And then the meeting of the month is a research debrief where we look at recent sports science articles. So a paper we looked at and kind of analyzed was, I think it was Ukrainian female weightlifters across a macro cycle, across like a training plan. What were the effects of fatigue on technique? So basically, like, what was the height the bar was pulled to based on the period of training? So looked at general prep phase, specific prep, and then a competition prep. And it's like, how does someone's technique change with fatigue? As a coach, that's super empowering to know that, hey, we're doing a general block of training. We have a shitload of volume, and it's going to suck. And your technique's going to like change a little bit. You're not going to pull the bars high. You have to meet it lower. We're going to have to tighten things up. As we let off some of that training, you're going to get better and better, so you can meet the bar more efficiently. You can potentially pull it higher. So we're looking at research like that, and we're breaking it down and delivering it to people so they don't have to go out and go on, Sci-Hub or Google Scholar, ResearchGate. Mm-hmm. And then Chris is like breaking down the methods, results, the sections of a paper. So really, it's to give you all the information you need. And I think we're doing currently the best job we can, and we're working on even doing that better kind of as time goes on.
Yeah, that sounds like a cool process. You mentioned Chris Tabor. I listened to a podcast that you did with him. I think it was back in November. You guys talked about AEL training.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go for it.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on the if now I don't know if you guys talked about this in that particular podcast. I've looked at some research that Travis Mash has done and put out there. And my question is, if you guys have talked about any correlation with the time of the eccentric loading, whether that be over a short or like a normal or fast eccentric time versus an extremely slow, drawn out eccentric, and what effects those have on force output versus hypertrophy.
Yeah. I would ultimately think with anything, if we really, really zoom in, we would say there's a dose response relationship with anything that exists, right? You provide a dose, there's an effect. You provide a little bit more, there's a little bit more of an effect. Now the curve can change. It's not like a curve you can like transpose or overlay on everything. Mm-hmm. But we know that with muscle hypertrophy, it's like you do one set, that's like better than nothing. You're going to get results, especially if you're untrained. You do 2 sets, it's a little bit better. 3 sets. And then you see this curve develop to where when you hit like, 10 to 15 sets, maybe closer to 20, like you probably hit a lot of the gains you're going to make. And that curve flattens out a lot. Mm-hmm. So we can take that with a lot of different things. So with AEL, I'm sure there's a dose response where it's like you do a little bit of it, you're going to get some effect. Yeah. If you do it solely, you're probably going to diminish a lot of that.
Sure. And for the people listening, AEL stands for accentuated eccentric loading. So for example, it would be something like you add weight releasers to a bar during a back squat. So you're overloading the eccentric portion, and then the weight releasers drop once you hit the bottom of the squat, and then you're lifting a lighter weight on the way up.
Yeah, there's a value that's commonly thrown around that you can produce, roughly 120% of the force eccentrically that you can concentrically. Sure. Like I don't think that's like the end all be all number. There's tons of variability that exists, but the idea that like you can probably but you can lower a weight that's heavier than the weight you can lift up.
Right.
Weight releasers, much like I would say the idea behind chains and bands is it's supposed to accommodate some difference, right? With weight releasers, it's overloaded in the eccentric portion, so you can pop up out of the bottom, take advantage of that. And there would be a potentiating effect to where you would have a heavier load, and on the way down, you kind of like contract all the muscles and then make a more forceful response out of the bottom. How that's affected by duration, I'm not sure. I don't know how that'd be altered. My thought is you would probably want to move as quickly as controlled and then take advantage of that. So when you kick into the bottom and release, and you can explode out of the bottom as quickly as possible. I don't know if delaying it would have much of an effect. I don't know if it would even have like a significant hypertrophy effect, because it's such a small amount of volume.
Sure.
So I think it would more so just augment the technique. I don't think it would have like a super robust physiological response.
Okay. Have you messed around with any of that in your own training or your athletes training?
Not that specifically. And I'd say the reason is logistically, it can just be kind of a chore.
Right.
And I think too, like the addition of different training tools can be useful if you really hit a plateau, or you're looking for a very specific effect or adaptation that's driven mostly by that actual implement. Because you buy weight releasers, you load them, you hook them up, and then you're hoping for this like super robust or huge change, and it's like maybe marginal. So I haven't personally tried it. I have tried bands and chains a little bit, and I'd say that was for this. There are a few lenses you can look at that through. It can be, well, we're accommodating the strength curves or unloading it in the weakest position and loading it more in the strongest position, which is kind of backwards as a raw athlete or weightlifter. You want to make sure the load's constant, so you can load it in the hardest position so you get stronger there. If you unload it, you're getting stronger where it's easiest, but there's not as much of a beneficial effect. If we're talking about jumping, power production, something that's more on the athletic side of performance than on the weightlifting side, there could be a benefit. And I could see there being like a technical benefit too of having something really heavy pulling you down, so you can't really sway, you can't get pulled out of position.
It forces you to brace like super, super hard.
That's
and
right.
Like
that's right.
Almost teaches the person if they're not knowing how. I don't know. Honestly, it's like
I get
especially like walking out with bands on the bar. If you're not braced, that is gonna destroy you.
Yeah, so I think with training tools, the way I like to think about it, and this is kind of what I think Max and I and weightlifting enthusiasts, nerds deep dive in is, you tell me that there's a weight releaser. It's not just like what's the effect on eccentric force production, but it's like what's the effect on technique. What's the effect on enjoyment of training? What's the effect on like novelty within a program? Resensitizing just more typical training. What's the sequencing effect? So if we do that farther out, what's the effect, closer to when we want to peak? So when we think about different training tools, we can think of them a little more holistically, right? Which is farther out, we're going to have more variation in training. We're going to focus on different adaptations. That can look a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to look cookie cutter, back squat, front squat, 3x8, 3x10, and then we're going to sequence that by sets and reps. It could be, we've got a chain squat, we have a banded squat, we have, some sort of weight releaser. And that's like on a variation day. We have a more classic day. We have all these different days that occupy different buckets, do different things, and we can progress that over time. So I think it's fun to kind of think about those things and their how they could, fit different contexts of training.
And that's kind of where the art of the coaching comes in, is playing with all those different variables and kind of making it your own with those scientific principles in mind that are kind of leading the way.
Yeah. And if we think about training, and I like this picture that's often drawn of training as a black box. Really what you do is you put things into the black box, which is you apply stress to a physiological system, a complex physiological system. And you say, hey, what's going to happen? It's basically taking a bunch of different ingredients in different quantities, but not knowing exactly how it's going to come out, right? Because maybe the temperature of the oven just changes sporadically and you don't know how it's going to change. Maybe the application of heat changes, maybe the actual ingredients change to where, you have whole milk, but the next time you don't know it, but you have 1% milk. And there are these small changes because all training is training. Barbells are barbells, discs are discs. Weight is just like something exerting itself on you. That's not going to change. It's always held constant, but the application of it and the assimilation of that, right, and the adaptations that result, it's unpredictable, and you can get closer to, but you're never going to perfectly do it, which is, to that article that you brought up earlier. The purpose of that was to say you can't perfectly predict training. Don't try. Build in some systems to accommodate that. And that's where a good coach-athlete relationship comes in, and the art of coaching comes in, which is, yeah, you don't feel great. Your technique looks like shit. We should probably back off a little bit. We thought training would be processed perfectly, and you'd get stronger and better. And it's like, something's just not working. And we've done this before, and it should work. And everything points, all the signs point towards performance. It's just not computing, right? So you pull your souffle out of the oven and it's completely deflated. It's like, you gotta start over and try again. Come up with something else.
I like that. So and a similar article, well, somewhat similar that you had written also was it had a great catchphrase title, "The Secrets of Chinese Weightlifting." Kind of, so we talked a little bit about the bands and chains of like kind of what I would consider like West Side style, like accommodating resistance, that type of stuff. But kind of on the other side of the spectrum is getting a lot of those like hypertrophy and like bodybuilding style movements in there, which is more known for like the Chinese style weightlifting. But anything that you remember from pulling from that article on that side of the spectrum to being like, okay, this is really helpful. We can draw things from that.
Yeah, I would say the articles themselves are interesting because they what they aim to do is funnel you to a specific thesis or piece of information. It's, hey, starting broadly, what's Chinese weightlifting? Why is it relevant? What do we want to know about it? What are they doing differently? Okay, what exactly is it? So we funnel you down to that. Really, where we should live is at the top of the funnel, right? Ultimately, which is like, why is Chinese weightlifting relevant in the first place? And if you look at a lot of their training strategies, it's like aggressive bodybuilding. And the reason why that's relevant is because a lot of my focus and a lot of my thinking has kind of been on this idea of hypertrophy is a incredibly important adaptation. We want to build as much muscle as possible. I mean, it's the contractile machinery that moves weight. You don't move it with bone and tendon and ligament. You move it with actual skeletal muscle that shortens and lengthens. And it's a complex system, right? Because it spans many joints, many lengths, many angles, but ultimately it's these contractile units that just pull closer and get pulled farther apart. And if we can make them bigger and more forceful, we're going to be a better athlete if we can coordinate it. So with that, I would say there's this emphasis on hypertrophy training more often, or at least for a longer part of the year. So we're going to have more hypertrophy focused blocks, and we're not just going to focus on getting strong, because you can focus on getting strong and hitting a PR, and that's what could be called like a short to medium term strategy. Whereas building size, right, is a long-term strategy. It's something where you're depositing money into an account to pull it out later, knowing that it's generated, a substantial increase since you put it in. That's what hypertrophy is. So it's like, how do we dedicate more time, add in more accessory work, add in more quote unquote bodybuilding to get bigger, and then say, we don't know when that's going to turn over. You can't predict it. You can't say, well, I put on like 200 grams of muscle, like I'm definitely better. But you will know when you hit a PR, it's probably a combination of good programming, getting bigger, getting more technical, and then kind of dialing in like fatigue management within all of that.
Okay. The barbell doesn't lie. They'll show you the results.
Yeah,
I like
that's
it.
Exactly right.
Kind of similar on that aspect. So we talked about a little bit about how if you store, like you get the hypertrophy, you store that away, like as like you bank it. As far as training for strength, this is a more broad question. Training for strength versus hypertrophy. There's always the argument like, oh, I'm really trying to get as strong as possible, versus you have the bodybuilders who are trying to get as big as possible. And I know there's some discrepancy there, but I mean, if you think about it, okay, if I gain more muscle, I therefore will have more strength, but there is a little bit more of like specificity built in there as well. And a similar question, basically a part two on that is another article you had written was about some of the fiber typing with weightlifters. I want to see if that kind of factors into that, the training, either for strength or hypertrophy.
Yeah. So I think most simply, hypertrophy oriented training is going to be best done by focusing on volume of work, right? So you have a few different like principles of hypertrophy training, which would be volume, like training volume, however you measure that. If you do sets, reps, volume, load, different ways to do that. And then you would have proximity to failure, which is intensity. So it's how hard are you training? Those are kind of the two main principles. So you need to prioritize doing enough work to get bigger, which when we talk about a dose response relationship, it's going to be more than 1 set or 2 sets or 3 sets. It's probably going to be closer to, 10-ish, 15, upwards of 20. And that's like per muscle group. Or body part, if you want to talk about it like that. So I would say hypertrophy training is more predicated on big ranges of motion, volumes of training. I would say like repeatable, reliable technique, and then having the correct proximity to failure, which is going to be probably closer to failure. Or if load is kind of used correctly, right? If the weight's heavy enough, you can stay a little bit further from failure, right? Because load kind of remediates the need to push to failure. Gotcha. So hypertrophy is a little different in that respect. Maximal strength, maximal force production within a task or within a movement constraint, basically. That's more focused on load. So I think Dr. Pack, I did a podcast with him, which was great, but he has a lot of work on the minimum effective dose for maximal strength. And he's shown that, in certain powerlifters, national level powerlifters, I believe, like one deadlift at like 90% or above, and then like maybe a few back offs was enough to get stronger. So it's not volume with training necessarily that's driving a maximal strength response or adaptation. It's the intensity, and it's also the movement. So you can see different research where you get stronger or bigger from a leg press. It doesn't translate to squat performance because the movements are different. So the principle of specificity comes into play. So with maximal strength, it's a skill, right? To be able to express force and coordinate the movement. And then it's very load dependent. So in really, well thought out programs, you're going to see high intensity lifts because it's going to drive a strength response. And then you're seeing enough training, enough volume to maybe focus on building muscle or preserving muscle, and to practice the skill and to get those repeated bouts of high force production. So those are some of the two differences. As far as fiber typing goes, that was an interesting paper because I'm pretty sure they looked at like Sarah Robles, Morgan King, a bunch of the USA greats.
And they literally took the fibers out of their, like, what was it, their quad or something like that? Or
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's their vastus lateralis.
Yeah,
it's a muscle biopsy, so it's basically like a very big needle that just shears through your muscle and then pulls it out.
Was that Andy Galpin?
Yeah, it was out of his lab. So it was Nathan Serrano, who was one of his students. And basically, the big takeaway for me is, training equalizes all of this.
Sure.
If you train correctly, you train to get better and stronger and become a better weightlifter, like your muscle fiber types are going to reflect that, knowing they're kind of a moving target. There's no like, oh, you only have this and you only have that. There's kind of the shifting that will happen because of a lot of deeper physiology that we probably want to get into. But it's not as black and white as it used to be presented. I think if you read like old basic sports science textbooks, you're like, oh, we have like type 1, type 2, type 2X. And it's like there are many hybrids. Things move in between. Very few 2X fibers that you're going to find. And the adaptations that take place that are reflective of a sport generally are created because of weightlifting, not like the determinant of weightlifting.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So in other words, like the fiber type that people are born with different percentages, essentially they're more naturally to have. So that can be changed or adapted through training or through like the said principle, specific adaptation to opposed demands of, okay, the fibers will kind of start to match what type of training that you're doing essentially.
Yeah. Right. Like, it's one of those things where it's really deterministic. If you're like, man, I'm just really slow. And it's like, if you do a lot of ballistic training, like something's going to happen.
Yeah.
You're not going you won't be Usain Bolt, but like no one else will either.
Right.
So a lot of it is like, find the training that you need. A lot of the, assessments that exist in like sports science and in performance science are meant to say, are you a more explosive or are you a stronger athlete? What do you need? The dynamic strength index is one of those. It looks at force produced in a counter movement jump, force produced in an isometric tasks, and then it compares them. And it would say like, oh, you're too strong. You got to get more explosive. Coaches know this. Sometimes it's helpful to have a reference and to say like, yeah, we probably should be doing more, classic lifts, full lifts, powers versus heavy strength work. So I'd say, yeah, a lot of this is determined by a host of factors. Different muscle groups have different compositions of different muscle fibers and different types. I think skeletal muscle is really cool. I just recorded a podcast with a psychiatrist actually about mental health and the role of strength training and physical activity in improving mental health. And he kind of references muscle as a neuroendocrine organ. So it has an influence on the brain. And that kind of the overarching point was like, strength training, resistance training is great for mental health. Right. And it's one of the 5 buckets that he focuses on as a psychiatrist, which is nutrition, physical activity, sleep, actual therapy, like psychotherapy, and then medication. So I think that kind of creates or paints this picture of training is important, building muscle is important, and being fit is very important. And what that looks like is like, it's kind of up to the purview of the person who's writing it, right?
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, you hear it all the time. Oh yeah, so exercise is good for your mental health, but to see someone that's actually a psychiatrist putting that into their practice, like, here, I'm going to prescribe you you need to do some exercise. Like I didn't know that was even happening. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what we're all here for is to be more evidence informed and to say, how do we train to optimize performance? How do we train to get health benefits from it? And what are the health benefits? And it's really cool, to have that confirmation bias of, oh, I'm stronger, I'm more muscular, I'm fitter. And it's like, oh, I'm also healthier. And if I didn't do this, he made an interesting point. He's like, athletes who, were so used to physical training, when they back off, they start to experience bouts of, poor mental health. And, sure. And a lot of that's like an ode to sometimes you forget what you have because you're so used to having it. And the quality of your health, because you're training, you forget what it's like, or you've never known what it's like to not have that. So you almost take it for granted. So at the crux of all this, I think it kind of paints a bigger message too, which is train in a way that's, best informed by all the available information. And ultimately the most important thing is, did you do as much as you can do? Do you show up and put on the best performance possible? And are you getting the, the health benefits and all of the other benefits that come from the social, emotional aspects of training and competing?
Really cool. I know we kind of jumped around some of these topics a little bit, so I'm gonna come back to the start just for a second because I realized we didn't go into any of the rapid fire questions, so I kind of want to ask you some of these, even though we didn't get to do it yet, because I do think they're kind of interesting. But so thank you for bearing with me for jumping all over the place. But so a couple questions just so the audience can get to know you a little bit, and just because they're entertaining. But we'll start off with do you have a favorite coffee that you like?
Yeah, I love Pete's dark roast.
It's funny. That's what Max said. Yeah. Max said the same thing.
So Max, if you walk into his house, right? So he lives in a red house in Oakland. You walk in, you open the steel barred door. You open that. You open the big door. You walk into this little entrance area. You walk into his dining room. He has 2 green, kind of velvety fabric chairs, and then you walk into his kitchen and he has an espresso machine. It's a Breville espresso machine and Pete's beans, and you'll just rip Americanos. You'll have 2 to 3 Americanos every day, all day, so good. It is so delicious and convenient that he put one in the office at Max's gym. So you go into the office in Max's gym, you walk upstairs, and there's an espresso machine with Pete's beans, and it's some of the best coffee, and it's consistent and delicious. So I'd say, yeah, good on Max for picking that.
Man, I'm gonna have to get a bag of Pete's beans now. That sounds delicious.
They do sell it in Rhode.
Yeah, we can get some here. So. Similar question: Do you have a favorite go-to thing you make for breakfast?
I would say probably the most consistent thing is a Kodiak cake, which for people who are familiar, the Kodiak pancake mix is a high protein, high fiber, whole grain, quote unquote healthier alternative. I might get crucified for saying that. But it's like a healthier alternative. And those are things that like I make sure, I have as like staples in my diet. I think they're fucking awesome. Like maple syrup and peanut butter, banana, or strawberries. So Kodiak cakes and eggs are a staple.
That's all. That's a great choice. Next one's a little more subject matter. Favorite recent, or semi-recent book that, and I know you're in your PhD program, so it could be a textbook. That's fine. That's like influenced your like strength conditioning, weightlifting, powerlifting career.
Yeah, I would say if it's specifically training related, the things that have been like really influential are the Russian texts. And I don't remember exactly which one it was, but it's got someone, I think, catching a snatch in the bottom on the cover. You can get it off Bud Charnaga's websites, but it talks about the technique in like great vivid detail. It's like, if you don't know weightlifting technique, if you're unsure about like phases of the lift, how to talk about it, how to think about it and conceptualize it, it's literally written out in as clear a language as possible. And you can say like, if I read this cover to cover, I'm going to know the snatch, clean, and jerk and how to execute them perfectly. And then it's a matter of getting people to do that. So I'd say one of those Russian texts, I'll have to pull up the name and send it.
Interesting. Is it and it's written in English, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it's translated.
Yes, it's translated. Okay.
They're extremely dry though. I've read them as well, and it's like, if you can like get through it, there's so much information in there, but getting through it is sometimes very painstaking.
So I think, where I find myself now is I write in that same way. And I have someone who does all my copy editing. Her name's Sally French. Shout out to her. She's awesome. But she's like, you can't write like this. Like no one wants to read this. Like she like hook me in, like bring me in. So I'd say it's really dry. And I'm the type of person who it's like I would fall asleep reading that on, it's on my nightstand. I have it like a bedside lamp lit, and then I have a Russian text, and it's like that's a perfect nightcap. So that's kind of why we're where we are today. Yeah.
Yes, explains a lot. This is another interesting question because it was interesting for Max as well, because you guys have just both been in the podcast scene for a long time, in the weightlifting podcast scene. So do you have a favorite recent podcast that you've listened to?
Okay, I'm going to say after this episode, it's the Rhode Strength podcast.
Nice. Thank you.
Here's the vouch. No one does it better than these guys.
Hey, appreciate it.
I would say second to the Rhode Strength podcast. I'd say honestly, I find a lot of value in listening to my own podcast back to like process the information. So qualifier, but the Garage Strength podcast, I think it's called Masters of Sport. It's got good information as like from a coaching standpoint. So I consumed almost every episode. Listen to that. And then I would say that's tough. I think that's really the one I've been binging on. Oh, and the best one, period, for training is the Data Driven Strength podcast. Like those guys are cutting edge strength hypertrophy research, and it's like the highest level overview, but it's very, very practical. And I think they're doing really good work. And like same with the Weightlifting House, Zach Robinson, I met him in a gym in Columbus, Ohio. And I watched him go from an undergrad to literally a PhD candidate, coaching Lane Norton, running, a huge powerlifting team and creating the best content and like producing really high level research on training. So shout out to those guys. They do really good work.
That's cool. Nice. Next question is pretty similar. Well, it can be. This one's open-ended, but we got favorite Instagram accounts. Could be weightlifting, could just be, hey, that's entertaining, that's funny. I enjoy it when it pops up on my feed.
Okay. I would say Weightlifting House is like number one. Yeah. I think they're doing really good work. And I noticed, I haven't talked to Seb recently in a while, but they're collaborating with Nate Serwinski and maybe a few other people, and they're releasing like more documentary style videos.
Cool.
So it looks like they're kind of expanding into that territory. And I know Max and myself and probably Seb too, we talked about like how much that's needed in weightlifting to grow the sport, is these documentary style, athlete focused, like look at a day in the life of Carlos Nassar, who just snatched 180 and clean jerk 220 in the training hall. It's like,
yeah, it was nuts.
Yeah, it's like, what's he doing? We know what he's doing.
We know a little bit.
Get an inside scoop or an inside glimpse of that. Yeah,
I think like documentaries like Hamp the Champ by Nate, that was like incredible, and I think stuff like that is really what's gonna bring weightlifting up in this country. I think. I don't know. I think he just did such a great job with that. Like we put it on in the gym like a few times. Like everybody loved it. It was awesome.
Well, if you think about what people love from like the relics of weightlifting past, you have the School of Champions, and you have the other like Russian, training hall videos and the Iron Mind videos, and it's like, what are those? Like they'll look at the inner life of the Bulgarian national team or some of the titans of the sport. We need those now as like exactly what you just did. How can we reference those and say, oh, that documentary that was made about Carlos Nassar, like how badass was that? And that's now in line with like, you have, Stefan Botev from Iron Mind, you have Naim
Those are my favorite Iron Mind.
Yeah, then it's like, and now you have Carlos Nassar, and then it's like, where's Lasha? And how do you kind of build that into something that's not like a relic of the past, but something that's like a part of the future? And it's exactly what the UFC does with their like fight camp videos, where it's like, we're going to follow Henry Cejudo through his fight camp. We're going to follow, all these great fighters, Colby Covington, whoever they are, and give people an inside scoop into what they do, how they do it, and what that actually looks like as a professional.
Yeah, even CrossFit, I think, does a really good job of that. They put the documentaries all the time on Netflix. I think one just came out where they follow, I forget her name, one athlete, like kind of like a mini documentary style, like a day in the life, like on one individual athlete. So
that's cool.
Yeah, that would be cool.
CrossFit kind of was ahead of the game in that sense.
Yeah.
I remember like way back in the day, I didn't really do CrossFit, but I loved watching like the videos on Rich Froning and everything that they did back then. It was just like brings hype. Yeah.
Well, it's funny is like I cut my teeth on, day in the life videos, or, even lower than that. It's like a full day of eating videos on YouTube.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's my favorite YouTube fitfluencer eating today? And it's like, I'm going to watch this guy eat a Chipotle burrito. Like that brings me, some sort of immense satisfaction. And it's like, okay, how do we professionalize that and pull that up and pull that into weightlifting and say, okay, you're not watching Max Tuning or Matt Ogus or someone like that. You're watching, some of the great Romanian female weightlifters. You're watching Olivia Reeves. You're watching Solfrid. You're watching the best of the best, and you're seeing what it's like to train 2-3 times a day and train hard. Or if you're Olivia Reeves, what it's like to have 3 off days a week.
Yeah, trains 3 days a week. Now 4, but it's like incredible what she's able to do up at 3 days a week.
And what's funny is that's the level of like, that's how Glenn would talk. Glenn Penlay, before, way back before he passed, he talked about training, and he's like, yeah, I'd make these really massive changes to my programming. We went from doing 5 sets of 5 to doing 8 sets of 3. And it's like, Glenn, like, that's like a really small detail, small change that like, I don't know if it really matters. To him, that was groundbreaking. And it's kind of funny because Olivia talks about it. She's like, I went from 3 days to 4. I've trained, this week I trained 3 days. Next week I'll train 5. It's like to her, that's like a groundbreaking change that had a huge result. And for Glenn, it's the same thing. It's like 5 sets of 5 to 8 sets of 3. And for us, we're like, dude, my program's always changing. Or, I'm going from like 6 days on this program to 4 days on this to 3 days on this. And it's, it's a lot more all over the place. But it's interesting to see what can have a profound effect at, the highest levels.
Totally. Yeah, that's pretty wild. All right, next we have one more question. Switching gears here, or sorry, one more related question. We got somewhere you traveled recently for like competition style. So like I know you've done a lot of trips with Columbus, Oakland, but where have you been recently as far as like for weightlifting or powerlifting?
Yeah, I've had an insane travel schedule recently, and it's only going to get more insane. We did this year, we did Memphis for nationals. It was powerlifting nationals, nice. Colorado Springs for weightlifting nationals, Wilmington for finals. And then I've been to Oakland for training camp. I've been, trying to even think. I mean, some of these places escape me, but we're going to Wisconsin for regionals. I'm going to Vegas for USAPL regionals, and then I think we're going to do a weightlifting camp in Miami for weightlifting AI. So it's just like it's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of travel, but that's one of the things I really enjoy is seeing new places. Honestly, going to new coffee shops and trying like craft food. So I really like it. Yeah,
love it. Next one we got favorite weightlifting shoe.
Oh, it's a Nike Romeo too.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah,
that's what you wear, right?
Yeah.
Well, and the exact shoe I have. So I was an avid collector. I think I had the Georgian edition, which was like all white and red swoop, and then I had all red, gold, black, like neon blue, and then I moved to Oakland, and I don't think I had shoes, or I was going to send my buddy my Nike 2s, and Max was like, "Oh, you can have these old Nike 2s. They're all black. They're 9.5." Turns out it was the shoes he wore when he powerlifted. So it's like the shoes he squatted like 335 in, and it just did some fucking ridiculous shit. So I'm currently wearing those Nike 2s, and like that's probably going to be my last pair of weightlifting shoes. Yeah.
It'll last forever.
Yeah, I think they will. Nike 2s are built like that. They're built
They are.
Next question we got favorite recent like what have you been programming for your athletes that you've been liking as far as in like an accessory movement or not so much like one of the traditional lifts, but something like an add-on.
Yeah, I would say I kind of coined it this. It's the Vardanian snatch, but it's no hook, no feet, no contact. And
nice. After Norik?
After Yuri.
Okay.
His dad. Yeah. So I would say I remember Norik talking about no feet, no hook, no contact variations and like their place. And I never really used them. And then I started working with Max, and we kind of went through this like training of thinking about technique and exercise to impact it. We kind of came to the conclusion that like low hang snatches, low hang no feet snatches, and then like no feet, no contact, and like those variations, you can kind of mix and match, transform someone's technique. So you'll see a lot of my programs will have no contact, no hook, no feet, no contact, no feet, no contact, or no feet, low hang, no feet, low block. And people stay way more connected to the ground. They learn to use their arms correctly and trace the bar up their body, and they can actually pull the bar with their arms instead of just kind of shooting out with the hips and dropping down. So for people who are listening, that it's hard to figure out at first, but once you figure it out, it's going to transform your technique.
It's cool. I like that. I think Max had a similar.
Yeah.
I think you say no contact. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I'm doing the program he wrote for me, and it's like no contact cleans twice a week. So I was like, okay, of course. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Of course.
And then what's your favorite, this is an interesting question too. What's your favorite current kind of pump up, max out gym song?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. I would say a band that's near and dear to my heart, and I did a podcast with a lead singer. His name's Johnny Frank. The band is called Bill Murray. It's this like kind of metalcore, but he's gotten into country lately, so it's got like a country influence. I think he had Hardy feature on one of his songs, so like he's got a lot of different influence. He's got a saxophone player. He does all the production. Like, yeah, he's been producing music and playing music for a long time. He was originally in Attack back in like 2008 for people who know who that band is. And yeah, now he's in Bill Murray, and it's a guilty pleasure band.
Love
for
it.
Sure.
Love it. Cool. I always get great answers. I keep that question. I get great answers to that question. So that's awesome. All right. So we'll start to get into the wrap up a little bit next. But before I do that, I want to make sure we covered everything as far as I know we're doing this reverse order. So you're a PhD student currently at West Virginia, weightlifting, powerlifting coach over at Team Ada, and part of the Coach Logic or co-founder of the Coach Logic mentorship group. You run the podcast Philosophical Weightlifting. A frequent contributor on many other podcasts, including Weightlifting House. And you have your master's in sports science and coaching education.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. And I mean, like the list, it's one of those things where like the more you do, the more you get involved with. And I feel like the list just grows and grows. And one thing I remember a professor saying to me is like, you want your CV to be as big as possible.
Yeah.
So I definitely, after you rattled off all that, I definitely think I adhere to that advice pretty well. So thanks
Beautiful.
for that.
You're welcome. All right. So I guess wrapping up, anything in store for the future that you're super excited about? Anything you want to plug? Anything that's going to be coming up?
I'd say the mentorship group is definitely the place I'd direct people, because the Coach Logic coaching platform is going to be released soon. And through that coaching platform, people are going to get access to a dashboard by which they can kind of like maximize their time spent programming. So it takes it kind of aggregates all the greatest features from all the current platforms, along with like a spreadsheets and all that, and puts it into one place. So video analysis, technical analysis, the actual programming, data analytics, communication, all that stuff goes on through the app. So I'm really excited for that. And then, as far as I'm concerned, I still am weightlifting coaching and powerlifting coaching. So if people are interested in coaching, you can go to teammeta.com, drop a inquiry in the contact form. Listen to the podcast. I mean, that's really it. There's a lot of stuff that's cooking, but you're just waiting for it to bubble up.
Love it. And then final question we'll leave you with is it's a favorite quote mantra. And the way I describe this one is I took it from the Tim Ferriss podcast. I don't know if you were listening to that one, but you get where are you living currently? Are you in Oakland?
So I'm in West Virginia. I'm in Morgantown, West Virginia. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the major highway there? Like, what's the major highway near you?
Let's go with 71.
Okay. All right. So you get a billboard on 71. So kind of a billboard for your local area, and you can put whatever you want on it to kind of like a message to your community. Could be favorite quote, mantra, saying, anything you have off the top of your head?
Yeah. And I don't know how good of a job I do adhering to it, but I have it as my, I actually have it as my background on my phone. And I got, just to kind of wrap this up, I got really into something called acceptance and commitment therapy. So I'm a big psychology buff. If I wasn't in weightlifting and powerlifting and doing this thing, I'd probably be a psychologist. Right. And this is from Stephen Hayes, who was also on the podcast, but he says, given a distinction between you and the things you've been struggling with and trying to change, are you willing to experience those things fully and without defense, as they are and not as they say they are, and do what takes you in a valued direction in the situation? So I think a lot of that is like, we have all these experiences, fear, frustration, doubt. It's like, are you okay with dealing with that? Like feeling that fully and still doing what matters to you and still doing what you find valued. I
like that.
And a lot of that is because, our thoughts and feelings can be automatic. We don't necessarily like want them to happen or conjure them up, but we know what our values are and we still pursue them anyways.
I like that a lot. That's good. That's deep. That's a great answer. That's a great answer, especially for right on the spot.
Yeah. I'm actually a quote guy. I love quotes. Nice. I'll rattle them off. And I was like, okay, I'll go to the well for this one.
Love it. Great answer. I'm going to tell you what Max said on there. He said he's going to put for fun. This is the first time anyone's ever said this. He goes, I'm just going to put like a fake, like, hey, traffic ahead, or there's beach or something. Like, that's such typical Max humor. I'm like, I love it.
Yeah. Max is one of those guys who, if you sit with him long enough, you're just joking nonstop. I'm just talking shit nonstop. Yeah. That's great.
Oh my God, that's good. Well, awesome. So we'll wrap up with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you guys. Much appreciated.
And I'll hold you just for a second after I click record. But Rhode Strength, we're signing off. All right.